Hey everybody, this is Perch, and this is, over the weekend, there were a couple statements that were made, that two kind of different ones, but they relate together, and it's stuff we've been talking about here for quite some time. So basically, Gail Simone writes the following. She says, I had a very powerful Hollywood insider say that the success of the Fast and Furious franchise had a bigger effect on movie casts getting diversified than, quote, all the social media complaints combined. Interesting. I would suggest that's not as much interesting as obvious, but no worries. Again, this, if you're right in the zeitgeist of Twitter, of course, it seems like the center of the world. But really, I think if you've been listening to this channel and kind of statements from other people and looking closely at the numbers, this isn't a terrible surprise. But Gail goes on, this happened. Okay, I believe her. It happened. Because it makes sense. That's the funny part. It checks out. If he was being hyperbolic, I don't know. I doubt it. But even if it's just a commonly held belief at the top levels, it's interesting to consider. It punches holes in the beliefs of both conservative and liberal commentators. Sure, I think it punches holes in the beliefs of not just the commentators, but a lot of people on Twitter. And it does, but none of this is particularly surprising. Now, going back for a second, and we'll get to kind of the other statement that was made that kind of ties into all this. It makes sense. This is where I feel like social media in many cases has tricked us into believing abnormal, kind of crazy things. And in many cases, the marketing and the advertising and the promotion of Twitter and Facebook and groups like that is to present themselves as being very, very important. They need to for their own financial valuation as a company and to, basically keep shouting, I am relevant, until people say, yeah, they must be. And that's a little bit what's happening here. And the same thing, arguably, is true of the people who populate Facebook and Twitter. They make these comments and they want to be important. It's very easy to get likes. It's very easy to get followers. It's so easy to get followers, by the way. One, you could use the strategy of you follow me, I'll follow you. So in a lot of cases, people have this natural tendency to want to follow back. If they see that somebody is following you, you're kind of predisposed to follow them back. So one of the marketing strategies to go out there and they just blanket follow like as many people as possible, thousands of people, or to the limit, basically. And then they wait 10, 15 days, and then they clear those lists and they refollow a different group. And by doing this, they find their follower count can quickly surpass 10,000. And that's kind of this magical number in which it starts to be a self-perpetuating machine. You can also just go onto a number of different services and buy followers. Like you can buy followers for $50. You can get several thousand followers. You can certainly do those kinds of things if those numbers matter to you. Now, it's a bit of a game because I believe Twitter will go through and kind of weed those followers out over time. But it's very popular for celebrities and influencers and marketing companies to spend up to $1,000 to make their profile picture, their Instagram, their Facebook, their Twitter, other places. Doesn't work as much for YouTube. Certainly people pay for views, but it's really, you're talking about one-to-one engagement. And YouTube as a video platform is not quite that way in most people's minds. But you can certainly do that. Which just all this indicates that the people who have these big follower accounts may have gotten them by paying for it and are not the experts. And you can tell they're not the experts just by reading the tweets. But regardless, the part about what Gail writes, which is just obvious, again, is that, quality work, or if not quality, financially successful work, is far more likely to generate change than, maybe complaining on social media. And this is something that I think more and more people, it's starting to dawn on them. And in comics, it's absolutely important because you see these critically acclaimed, this is the best comic ever kind of tweets from people. And you see what's popular on Twitter does not reflect at all what's selling in stores. Now, since the shutdown, our numbers are a little bit abstracted. The numbers that you see out right now are guesses, and in many cases are wildly off. But you can go back, as we've done on this channel and other places, to 2019 and before, And you can see the same trends. You see what people are buying, and they're not terribly surprising. Big events, Batman, Spider-Man, sell really well. The brand new obscure character that maybe it caters to the LGBTIQ audience typically sells less, both because it's a brand new character, but more because the creative team involved on it are not big names. And so, shocking, it doesn't sell Jim Lee numbers. Nobody should be surprised by that. However, if you live on Twitter, you would think, well, this is the most popular book. And so Gail says, the success of the Fast and the Furious franchise had a bigger effect on movie cast being diversified. Yeah, you had a billion-dollar franchise, which had a cast that was, diverse, but also a plot that was easily digestible, one that could go to other international markets quickly and without much concern. And movies that are going to try and want to copy and replicate that success are going to, try and do the same DNA, try and get the same kind of mixed up cast to kind of have this mass market appeal. And that is definitely more powerful than social media complaints. I mean, that is obvious if you just sit down to think about it. So this other tweet comes from a guy named Brian Riddell. Sorry, Brian Riddell. And Brian Riddell writes, some Twitter is not real life data using Pew surveys. And if you look at Pew, you can see the stuff for yourself. So here's the interesting thing. Twitter users are D plus 15, meaning, typically liberal or Democrat, which would tie Hawaii and Vermont for the most liberal state, meaning Twitter users skew very heavily into one political, camp. And then and so the politics aside, this is the interesting point. 10% of Twitter users post 92% of the tweets. Okay, so 10% of all the people there are posting 92% of the noise. And those tweets, they say, skew, Democrat liberal, plus 43, which is, very far on the extreme. Forget again, Democrat, Republican. It's very far on the extreme. And then he goes on, and again, it's not the politics, it's the percentages that to really pay attention to. Here's the kind of the key. 3% of the population, I believe this is for North America, creates 90% of the tweets. So 3% is creating, for all intents and purposes, everything you're reading on Twitter. It says Twitter still matters and can be an leading indicator, but its outsized influence on media, corporations, and politicians seems to be the illusion of the numbers, and it is. Why does all this matter for comics? Well, because a lot of decisions are getting made, a lot of both editorial and content decisions are getting made based on basically 3% of the population. 3. Now, that's the entire population. How does that skew toward comic buying audiences? Well, we've seen a couple stats out there. We've heard the stat 5% of the comic market is active on Twitter. Okay, but it gets worse. So at first I thought, okay, 5% are active on Twitter. It means 5% of the comic audience are talking on Twitter. No, active on Twitter means you have an account and you check it. It doesn't mean you're necessarily saying anything. The people saying things was this earlier comment. 10% of the Twitter users, 10% of the people on Twitter are posting 92% of the tweets, the vast majority of them. This means if 5% of the comic market is on Twitter, 5%, then 10% of that is half of 8% are the ones that you're hearing for. So of the comic buying audience, half of 1% are the ones that are making the noise and making the comments. All the stan accounts, all the people shouting, all the people demanding various things. Half of 1%. To put it in a different way, you can lose that market and you would not even notice in the sales. Half of 1%. You wouldn't notice. The people who are screaming, shouting, making a lot of noise, any direction, represent a tiny audience to the larger comic market. Now, certainly, as we've seen with crowdfunding, if you can grab some of that audience and you can gear them at a particular title, you can make a lot of money off that one title. And that's good and that's important and it's a market strategy and good for them. Not taking anything away from that. It's powerful for that comic. But that's not indicative of the industry as a whole. The industry as a whole, it's in terms of the noise, in terms of the commentary, including me, includes all the people who are basically telling you what you like, what you don't like, what's supposed to happen. It can be interesting daytime activities, interesting distractions, interesting to kind of, I don't know, play with, but it does not matter from a raw numbers perspective. If you are a publisher, you have to look at engaging your audience that are buying your comic books and not thinking that Twitter or Facebook are a shortcut to that. Because the reality is, half of 1%, 0.5 of the loud noise on Twitter are actually buying comics. It does not matter. If you're trying to market via Twitter or Facebook, 5% of your audience, 5, meaning 1 in 20, will see your marketing. Maybe. That's not a good return on investment. If you're a new upstart company, if you're a small indie and you've grown your audience based on social media, certainly it's going to be much higher. But for any kind of the normal comic industry, it's insignificant. Which means you have to market other ways, which means you do have to get to the shops, which means you do have to figure out who's buying your comic, meaning you do have to talk to these people directly. You do have to try mailing lists and other things. There's no shortcuts. But I like, I like Gail Simone recognizing this. It's good that, hey, all of the complaints and social media, petitions and getting something trending and all that stuff, it doesn't matter. Money matters. If you can bring in millions of dollars, great. Now, this doesn't mean you don't have a voice and you shouldn't say anything, but it does mean if you're a person in charge, you have to actually dig to get the right information and not just listening to whoever the closest person is to you screaming. Let me know your thoughts, questions below, and thanks.